Welcome to the Natural Allergy Treatment Podcast. I'm your host, Jess, and joining me today is Jenny, our PAT expert naturopath based in Auckland, New Zealand. Hi, Jenny.
Hi, Jess.
We're part of Health and Wellness Australia and Auckland, who are a team of naturopaths around Australia and New Zealand that specialise in a natural allergy treatment called Positive Association Technique, or PAT. So in this episode, we're going to be talking all about reactions to dairy, which is one of the most common food allergies we see in our clinics. So it can affect anyone of any age, but it's more common in infants and children under 16. So if you suspect that dairy may be contributing to your symptoms, this is the episode for you.
Yeah, so we have got a big episode lined up today. It's such a huge topic. So we're going to be talking about each of the different components of dairy that trigger reactions, how PAT can help, some interesting history about how dairy became a staple in our diets, as well as some dairy-related question and answers that some of our viewers have sent through.
So to start us off, Jenny, could you explain the different types of reactions we can have to dairy?
Yes. So there are different types of reactions to milk, but there's only two types of kind of classic dairy allergies. So there's the immunoglobulin E, or the IgE mediated, and the non-IgE mediated. And these are a result of your immune system overreacting to one or more of the proteins in milk that you've eaten or drunk. So cow's milk is the most common cause of a milk allergy. However, there are other types of animal milk, including goat's milk and sheep's milk, that may cause your immune system to react as well. And there's also another reaction that you can have to milk called lactose intolerance, which is where your body lacks an enzyme called lactase and you can't digest the sugars in milk. And interestingly, reactions to milk can develop in formula-fed and breastfed babies because the milk proteins can actually pass through into the mother's breast milk from the mother.
So let's get started with the IgE-mediated reaction.
Sure. So a true milk allergy causes an allergic reaction by creating an immunoglobulin E or an IgE reaction after your first exposure to milk, which is made by your immune system. So the immune system mistakenly determines that the dairy proteins are harmful and responds by releasing chemicals such as histamine. These IgE antibodies that bind to mast cells or your allergy cells in your skin, respiratory tract, and cardiovascular system, which release the histamine, causing you multiple body system symptoms. So the severity of the symptoms can vary between people. So mild symptoms include hives, nausea, vomiting, abdominal pain, diarrhea, rash, itching, tingling, or swelling of your lips, tongue, and throat. But there's also really severe symptoms that can happen, which includes chest tightness, shortness of breath, difficulty swallowing, wheezing, dizziness, a drop in blood pressure, loss of consciousness, and even anaphylaxis. So it's huge. So if you have a milk allergy, then you are reacting to one or both of the proteins in milk, which are casein and whey. So casein is a byproduct of milk when it spoils and turns to solid, like, when it curdles. So it's also found in cheese and yogurt, and that it accounts for 80% of the protein in milk and gives milk its white color. This is the most common reaction of the two, but whey is a byproduct of the liquid part of milk when it curdles, and this accounts for the other 20% of the protein in the milk. So if you have a milk allergy, you react to all milk and its byproducts. And so this is where people often trip up because not everyone associates milk with other dairy products. So when you're looking at milk in all of its forms, that includes condensed, dry, evaporated, and powdered milk, milk from other mammals, including goats and sheep, butter, including butterfat, butter oil, and even artificial butter flavor, buttermilk, cheese, cottage cheese and curds, custard, pudding, yogurt, ghee, and sour cream. So, it's the whole range. And so, interestingly, people with milk allergies can usually tolerate the baked goods that contain the milk, such as muffins and cakes, but not everybody that can be good for.
And what's the difference when it comes to a non-IgE mediated reaction?
So an IgE-mediated response typically occurs immediately, where a non-IgE-mediated response involves other components of the immune system, and so it doesn't occur as quickly, and it's usually the cause of the gastrointestinal symptoms like vomiting, bloating, and diarrhea. And this is actually often why people can confuse the non-IgE-mediated dairy allergy with lactose intolerance. So this means that the non-IgE mediated reactions won't show up on a medical allergy test, So this can also cause further confusion for people because they're trying to work out what they're reacting to and it's not coming up on results anywhere.
So just to give a bit of a recap, as we are talking in quite technical terms today, there are two types of milk reactions, the IgE mediated and the non-IgE mediated. The IgE mediated reactions happen quite quickly after ingesting the milk or the milk product, but these non-IgE reactions are quite slow and can take up to 48 hours to develop. And there's also another specific condition called CMPA that's often seen in infants too.
Yeah, and this is a really common reaction that occurs in babies who have cow's milk or other dairy products made by milk. And it's called cow's milk protein allergy, or CMPA. And the interesting thing about this is it can be IgE mediated or non-IgE mediated. So it can be both. So CMPA can affect between 2 and 7.5% of formula-fed babies and about 0.5% of exclusively breastfed babies. So with exclusively breastfeed babies, developing CMPA is a result of the milk proteins from the products the mother has eaten transferring through to the breast milk. And with that immediate type IgE mediated, the signs and symptoms occur within a few hours. So there can be skin reactions, itching, swelling of lips, face, eyes, breathing issues, abdominal pain, vomiting, diarrhea, sneezing, itching, and runny or a blocked nose. With the non-IgA mediated reaction, this causes the delayed reaction where the symptoms can take days, if not weeks, to present. So they can include reflux, colic, eczema, a sore red bottom, abdominal pain, constipation, loose or frequent stools, blood and or mucus in stools. It's actually quite a common one, and faltering growth in some children. So this non-IgE milk allergy is usually associated with intense pain. So in these children, the pain, the cause of the pain is still kind of uncertain, but reflux is definitely one of those factors. But there's also this painful passage of wind or straining with stools and like this abdominal crunching and back arching that they can present with. So one of the theories is that there's a close proximity of the immune system. So, your gut's the biggest immune organ in your body with gut pain fibers. So your gut is actually the second biggest nervous system part. So they communicate with each other and this interaction can lead to this intense pain. Another thing about it is a lot of the symptoms can occur at night, and it's not completely understood why, but it may be because it's related to the transit of the digested foods in the lower intestine, so that's that painful wind. And this is one of the most disturbing and exhausting symptoms for families because, you're trying to get to sleep, everyone's tired, and then you have this baby that's like screaming and in pain. It's really quite traumatic for families. Also, eczema is a common association with CMPA as well. So most children will grow out of the CMPA, but it's usually longer than the supposed year that you kind of hear if you read on the net and stuff. So there's a pediatric gastroenterologist specialist, Professor Shea, who says in reality, most children grow out of their cow's milk allergy between the ages of 2 to 3 years. So that's like a lot longer. And so in her experience, many of these infants do begin to acquire some tolerance to milk before a year. And so they can usually have it in baked or heated forms, but not raw. So tolerance to raw milk is often even much later. So cow's milk allergy really is longer lived than most people think. But because CMPA can present with multiple symptoms, you need to get a correct diagnosis because something else could be going on. So it's important to talk to your healthcare provider about it.
Yeah, we actually had a question come through from an Instagram follower about how can you go about getting a diagnosis for CMPA with a 3-month-old?
Yeah, so an allergy test can be done to see if it's IgE mediated, but because it can also be non-IgA mediated, it's not really conclusive. And also it's not as reliable on babies under 3 months of old because they can actually get a false positive or a false negative. So it's not a good route to go down. Blood or mucus in the stool is a common sign that can be used to diagnosis, but only with other symptoms and by a pediatrician. The elimination diet is really the only definitive way to really see if it's the cause. But if the mother's breastfeeding, you have to be super strict because she needs to avoid all things that are dairy for it to get a clear read. And if they're bottle feed, it needs to be dairy free. So there's actually a lot of formula companies out there pushing really expensive dairy free options, but there are also cheaper versions like soy. So just shop around to see which ones will work before you go for the really high end stuff. Just to bear in mind, it can take between 2 to 4 weeks for symptoms to improve, so you've got to stick with it. And then if you've eliminated the dairy and you've had good results, you can reintroduce it. So it's sort of one portion of dairy, like a little bottle of yogurt or a milkshake or something, where there's a considerable amount, but just like one meal's worth. And then if the CMPA is a problem, then there's going to be a reaction about 72 hours later. And so that's going to confirm that it comes from the cow's milk. If no reaction occurs, do continue for a few more days eating more dairy just to make sure it actually isn't. So after a week, if there's none of those return of symptoms, then it wasn't the CMPA. But yeah, we also have something that we test for in our positive association technique session as well that you could look into, which also will help you sort of figure out what's going on.
Yeah, so dairy reactions, especially in babies, is something we see very commonly in the clinic. So could you explain to us how the PAT process works in this case?
Yeah. So we're all qualified naturopaths, and we use a form of muscle testing or kinesiology to assess your reactions to various food chemicals like the milk and the dairy, as well as a wide range of other food, airborne and chemical substance. So how the muscle testing works is you hold on to a sample vial of the substance, and we're looking for a change in your muscle strength to indicate a reaction. So if the muscle in your arm stays strong, then that shows that your body is okay with that. But if your muscle weakens, then it indicates a reaction to the substance. So when we're working with infants and children, we use a form of surrogate testing for the parent. And then we use this chiropractic tool called an AccuStim that stimulates the nerve bundles and the acupressure points down the side of the spine. And so while you're holding on to that sample, we help to retrain your body so it no longer has a negative reaction to the substance. Now, this type of testing only tells us that there's some type of reaction, not whether it's IgE mediated or not. So it can be useful when other testing methods have been inconclusive. And it also helps relieve the symptoms of the reaction.
So what are some of the factors that can contribute to the development of CMPA in some babies?
So for breastfed children, the level of cow's milk protein present in breast milk is about 100,000 times lower than in cow's milk. And so the symptoms are not often nearly as severe. And it's thought that the immunomodulators that are present in breast milk and the differences in the gut flora of a breastfed baby versus a formula might contribute to this. And there's this really cool thing the body does. There's a secretory immunoglobulin A in the breast milk that kind of paints a protective coating on the inside of the baby's intestines to prevent penetration by potential allergens like the foreign proteins from the milk. And it is a good thing to point out that the size of a cow's milk protein is really big. So it's really hard for a baby's sort of immature gut to break down. So the closest milk one that is the same size as breast milk is actually goat's milk. So if you're having a problem with the dairy, try the goat's milk. You might find that that's actually going to help. And then the next one to look at is C-section babies. So this is another factor to consider. So studies have shown that C-section babies face twice the risk of developing an allergy or an intolerance to cow's milk than other children, and that was according to a report in the medical journal Allergy. So the difference is that compared to infants born vaginally, children delivered by C-section are not exposed to less maternal bacteria, and then their digestive tracts are consequently not colonized in the normal way. And so they've also potentially been exposed to antibiotics and opportunistic pathogens associated with the hospital environment. So it sort of is a twofold. They've got less exposure to the good bacteria, and it can't colonize their gut, like their little starter kit essentially. So intestinal microbiome is a really has a really important role in signaling the developing mucosal immune system to make it strong. So in C-section babies, their immune system can overreact to these substances and they can become allergic to them. So it's a way to counter that is to give them baby probiotics, especially designed with the correct species for colonization in their gut.
Yeah, so we recently did an episode all about the gut microbiome and the link to allergies. So I'll pop a link to that in the show notes as well. But now that we've covered the milk protein allergies, let's have a look at the other major substance in milk that causes a lot of issues for people called lactose.
Yeah. So again, I mean, I find all this stuff really interesting. But the lactose intolerance is a reaction in your digestive system to milk sugar. So it's not actually an allergy. So it's because you actually lack this enzyme known as lactase, and you can't digest the sugars that are present in milk. So for lactose to be absorbed, it needs to be hydrolyzed in the intestine by beta-galactase enzyme called lactase pyrazine hydrolase, which we basically call, or generally call, lactase. So this enzyme hydrolyzes lactose into the simple sugars so that we can digest and absorb the sugars. So in adults with the lactase deficiency, the lactose is not digested in the upper bowel, so it reaches the lower bowel where it gets fermented by gut microorganisms, which can produce hydrogen, carbon dioxide, and methane gases. So that's where you get that abdominal pain, the bloating, and the flatulence from it. And then these undigested lactose also draws water into the intestinal lumen through this osmotic effect, which can cause diarrhea. So when we are babies, our bodies that make this enzyme, so it allows us to digest the lactose in breast milk. But after babies are weaned, this enzyme in some people stops being made, and we can't properly digest the lactose in the milk, which can result in these digestive symptoms of the flatulence, the painful cramps, and the diarrhea. So symptoms will really depend on how much dairy that you eat or drink and how sensitive you actually are to it.
So how did it come about for some of us to be able to continue consuming lactose in cow's milk once we are weaned?
So in some people, the lactase enzyme stays switched on. But to better understand this, we kind of need to look back at human history and milk in our evolution. So humans as a species began developing about 3,000 years ago, but we didn't actually start drinking milk until about 10,000 years ago. So the first people to drink milk were the early farmers in Western Europe, because they began domesticating and living with animals, including cows. So they're the first ones to actually start milking the cows. And so they most likely would have had reactions to milk originally, but they've evolved the ability to kind of keep this lactase enzymes through into adulthood as a result of mutations in a section of DNA that controls the activity of the lactase gene. So this has been termed lactase persistence and has allowed them to drink milk without side effects. So this lactase persistence trait was favored by evolution. And so in Northern Europe, more than 90% of the population are lactase persistent, as are some other populations in Africa and in the Middle East. But there is also several populations where this is much rarer. So many Asians, Africans, and people from South America don't have this. So historically, when you look at these populations, the trait comes from those who raised livestock, not the hunter-gatherers or the forest gatherers who cultivated plants. So it kind of makes sense that they didn't actually have access to animal milk, so they were not under any evolutionary pressure to adapt to drinking it. But fast forward now, and it's actually more common to have lactose intolerance than those that are lactase persistent. So some experts estimate about 68% of the world's population has a lactose malabsorption, which is huge. So people who are lactase non-persistent can still eat certain amounts of lactase without ill effects. So drinking a small amount of milk is fine, but it's that whole accumulative problem. So, the more that you eat of it, the more you're likely to get a reaction. But there's also the option of processing, milk into butter and yogurt and cream or cheese. So all of these reduce the amount of lactose. Hard cheeses like cheddar have less than 10%, as much lactose than milk. And butter is really low. And heavy cream and butter sort of are the lowest in lactose. But you just got to be aware that lactose can actually also be present in non-dairy foods. You've got to check the packaging. So common foods that may have it are bread and other baked goods, processed foods like soups, margarine, flavored chips, processed meats, even not those non-dairy liquid and powdered coffee creamers can contain it. So the reason why they add it to processed foods is it kind of provides a texture and it binds well with water and color. The other thing to watch out for is some prescription medicine and over-the-counter medicines can contain it, including ibuprofen, which is really common, and also this a very common antidepressant called citraplam. So other kinds of medication habits that are medications that treat stomach complaints, including acid reflux and flatulence, which I find completely ironic because that's what lactose intolerance causes. There's also, it's found in calcium supplements, birth control pills, sexual dysfunction medication, insomnia medication, muscle relaxants, and even other anxiety medication, among lots others.
Yeah, that's wild to think that it's in so many different foods. Like it's not something that you'd usually think of. So when it comes to lactose intolerance, is it just something you're born with, or can you suddenly become lactose intolerant later in life too?
Yeah, well, actually, you can. And this form of lactose intolerance occurs when your small intestine decreases lactase production. And that's usually after an illness, an injury, or surgery involving your small intestine. So, diseases associated with secondary lactose intolerance include an intestinal infection, celiac disease, bacterial overgrowth, and Crohn's disease. And it's also important to note, too, that the symptoms of lactose intolerance are similar to those with other digestive disorders like IBS or IBD, which is inflammatory bowel disease. And so it can actually go undiagnosed because people think that they only have lactose intolerance or they only have IBS. So it is actually possible to have both as well. But all of that makes it a lot trickier to figure out what's going on.
So can you actually be sensitive to lactose without the enzyme deficiency as well?
Yeah, you can. So this is where PAP can also be a really beneficial treatment option when it's a sensitivity rather than it's actually caused by this enzyme deficiency.
So if so many of us are still reacting to or struggle to digest milk, why is it so popular in the Western world?
Wow, people that have listened to these before, how much I love my history. So sadly, but not uncommonly, it actually has to do with marketing, the war, and excess supply. So, in America and other countries like England, Australia, New Zealand, we've had school milk programs and milk in our schools since the beginning of the century. So during World War II, in America, they needed to boost milk production in order to make processed dairy products that they were sending to their soldiers overseas. Like plastic from milk was even used in airplanes, which is crazy. So farmers weren't producing enough to meet this demand because they weren't getting paid enough. So the US government decided to create the demand for milk by giving the milk to the children in the schools. So that way that they would have enough so they could make this processed products that they needed for the soldiers. There's also a time when more people were moving into cities and women joined the workforce more. So cow's milk became seen as this really convenient way to give babies nutrition if women were not at home to breastfeed. And then there was also this perfect storm around 1920 where the agricultural community, the scientific community, and the governments all came together with this message of the nutritional perfection of milk. And this was encouraged and advocated by John Harvey Kellogg. You might recognize that last name. He was the inventor of the cornflakes.
Yeah.
And also he was a head doctor of a sanitarium in the US, and he stated that milk was a simple, earthy, and natural, one of the purest things to eat and drink. And the fact that it was the color white actually really helped this agenda because white is the color of purity. And then protein and fats and carbohydrates had just been discovered. And so milk had all three of those. So it ticked a lot of boxes. And then the discovery and the isolation of the vitamins and the minerals came next. And so then there was this almost universal acceptance that in order to get enough calcium for bone growth, we had to drink milk.
But do we really?
Well, no. So large studies have failed to find associations between milk consumption and fewer bone fractures. In fact, there's countries like Japan and India where the population is predominantly lactose intolerant, so where the milk intake is actually really low, and hip fracture rates are also low. But so many of these cultures do a lot more weight-bearing activities than the Western world, and research shows it's actually better to be physically active than to drink milk as a way to strengthen your bones. So it is entirely possible to have a healthy diet without milk. But it's still kind of touted as this fundamental food, and children every day are told to drink their milk, make your bones strong. So the National Dairy Council actually recognises that foods like kale, bok choy, and broccoli all have higher rates of calcium absorption than milk. In fact, even 2 tablespoons of dried ground basil has almost the same amount of calcium as a glass of milk. So what I find fascinating is like a researcher, Valais, she puts it really well when she says that milk benefited from a specific cultural treatment. A story spun around its chemical and social qualities that kind of vaulted it into levels of adoration that it perhaps didn't entirely deserve. So people are always searching for this magic commodity, or this magic bullet, she says. Today fad foods and scientific justifications or moral judgments are on every corner. It'll be interesting to see whether of them last. Like she says this, and I love this. She goes, I would love to see what happens to kale, because kale had its little moment a couple of years ago.
Yeah, exactly.
So milk kind of had that, but it stayed in the mainstream.
Yeah, it's definitely cemented its place into the Western diet for sure. And there's just so much about cow's milk. Like, we haven't even gotten onto the topic of A2 and A1 milk.
Yeah, so this is also huge. And there's a little bit of history and evolution and proteins here too, so bear with me. So I've been following the A2 revolution with some interest after hearing Keith Woodford, who's a professor of farm management and agribusiness in New Zealand. He did a talk about his book called The Devil in the Milk in 2007. And since then, I switched to only A2 milk. And regrettably didn't buy shares in it because A2's kind of become one of the New Zealand's biggest share earners. So basically, and there is a lot more I could go into here, the whole thing about A2 is that there is a protein in milk called beta-casein, which originally came in the form of A2 beta-casein, which is the same primary protein that's found in breast milk. So it's much easier for the body to absorb. So at some point during the cow's evolution, there was a genetic mutation that created A1 beta-casein variant. And that's sort of resulted in most commercially available cows sort of being a hybrid mixture between A1 and A2. But the problem is this new variant A1 in some people forms an inflammatory peptide called beta-casomorphin 7 or BCM7. Now this can cause digestive symptoms such as diarrhea or recurrent infections. So recurrent tonsillitis as a teenager is like a classic sign of A1 casein sensitivity. It causes inflammation, type 1 diabetes, heart disease, behavioral problems, food intolerance, allergies, premenstrual mood symptoms, period pain, autoimmune conditions. Like it's huge. So that's one side of it. But the other part of the problem for these A1 cows is that they contain a histidine residue in the beta-casein protein or in their amino acid structure. So histidine is a precursor to histamine. So that means when you're drinking A1 milk, you're more likely to have an allergic symptom to it. So the A2 doesn't contain this. Rather, it's got a proline residue. So some people, when they, if they react to A1 milk, the symptoms will go away when they switch to the A2 milk and the other associated dairy products. The other things that don't have this A1 in them is butter, cream, and ricotta or whey protein powder, because it's a casein, which is the protein part. So whey is the other part of that protein. So there's also obviously cows that don't only have the A2 casein. So there's a lot of farmers in New Zealand that now just only their whole herd is just A2. Like there's a huge movement to try and get New Zealand actually to be all A2 cows. But that's, in the future. And then also goat and sheep don't contain the A1 casein. So their milk products don't as well. And another thing that's really interesting is that people that crave A1 or milk, when they're having an inflammatory reaction, react to it. So they want it even though it's bad for them.
And that's something we hear quite a lot with these kind of inflammatory foods or when you crave the thing that you're reacting to. So that's really interesting too. You also came across an interesting link between milk allergies and beef allergies.
Yeah, so people with milk allergies may have an allergic reaction after eating beef. So it wasn't actually considered a very common allergen, and so historically it wasn't really looked for in testing. But recently it's been researched as more people have discovered that they react to it. So there was a recent study of 365 children in Honduras who were seen in an allergy evaluation, and they underwent skin prick testing and an oral food challenge, and it was reported that pork and beef were actually more common allergens than peanut, fish or soy. So, that's huge. And then there was another study of 689 adults in Pakistan who demonstrated that the beef allergy exceeded those with allergies to peanut, fish, soy, and milk. So the primary beef allergy is the bovine serum albumin, so BOS-D7. So this is actually present in both the meat and the milk of mammals. So it's not really surprising that some people with milk allergies will have reactions to red meat. But interestingly, people who have a meat allergy nearly always have a dairy allergy, but not everybody that has a dairy allergy will react to meat. And I also just wanted to do a bit of a segue into meat allergies, as there's two other reactions that can happen with meat. One being a similar crossover between proteins, and another involving the ever-increasing problem with the ticks. So there's this thing called pork cat syndrome, and this is where people who are allergic to cats can also react to pork. So this happens as the cat allergies come from inhaling the dander and the hair of the cats, and the primary allergen is cat serum albumin, or FeL-D2. So this can have a cross-reactivity to pork serum albumin, which is sus-S1, when the pork's eaten. So this can also happen with the beef allergen, bovine serum protein BOS-D6, but pork is more common. So it's kind of estimated that 1 to 3% of people who actually are allergic to cats can also have this cat pork syndrome, which is actually quite a lot. And then also there's this other allergy called alpha-gal syndrome, which is also called red meat allergy, and that can affect people who eat beef, pork, bison, lamb, venison, and or goat. So this reaction occurs after being bitten by a tick. So when a tick bites you, that bite transfers alpha-gal, which is a type of sugar molecule in your body. So then your immune system develops a response to this molecule. So when you eat products that also contain the alpha-gal, you have allergic reaction. So these foods are from red meat, organs, but also products that are made from them, including milk, blood products, and gelatin. So there's only certain species of ticks that can cause this reaction, but it's most prevalent in North America with the Lone Star tick, but it's also been found in ticks in Australia, Europe, and Japan. So it's definitely around.
I remember when we opened up in Murwillumbah, we saw a real uptake in cases because that's a bit of a tick hotspot in that area as well. So what kind of symptoms can this cause for people?
Yeah, so there's hives, itching or itchy scaly skin, swelling of the lips, face, tongue, or throat, or other body parts, wheezing or shortness of breath, stomach pain, diarrhea, an upset stomach or vomiting. So the thing that's about this that makes it difficult to diagnose is the time delay between eating meat products and getting an allergic reaction is quite a long time. So that's one reason why it's not really being known about as much. So for example, if you've eaten steak with dinner, but then you wake up in the middle of the night and you've got hives, people don't often connect the steak with the hives. So researchers think they know the reason for this delayed reaction. It's sort of due to the alpha-gal molecules taking longer than other allergens to be digested and enter the system, so it kind of moves slower into the body. But the concerning thing about alpha-gal syndrome is that it often develops in adults who have had no prior history to a atopic disease, which is like that allergic reaction that produces an exaggerated IgE response. So usually atopic reactions begin in childhood with sort of that atopic march, which is atopic dermatitis followed by allergic rhinitis and then a food allergy or asthma. So it actually can cause anaphylaxis in some people. So it's actually a really serious reaction.
That's so fascinating, and especially that it really can affect anyone. It's not just the atopic types that need to be mindful of it too. But now that you've covered quite a bit about dairy, we want to finish on some questions that we've had come through from our subscribers about what they want to know. First up, does dairy cause excess mucus production?
So the answer is technically no. In conventional medicine, they say it can feel like that, as when you when sort of milk and saliva mix in the mouth, they can create this thick liquid that briefly coats the mouth and front throat, so it kind of feels like a buildup of phlegm. But in Chinese medicine, milk is considered damp forming, and excessive dampness can manifest as phlegm and mucus in the respiratory system, leading to conditions like coughing and nasal congestion. So in cold or wet months, they recommend to swap the salads and the raw foods for soups and cooked foods, and if you consume a lot of dairy products, then reduce them. Also, sugary foods, fatty foods, bananas, and concentrated juices can also contribute to damp settling in the body. So reducing those as well.
Mm. And can you eat dark chocolate if you're lactose intolerant?
The answer is yes, you can have it. Usually, dark chocolate is dairy-free, as it's only made with cocoa solids, sugar, and cocoa. But some manufacturers may add milk or milk powder as an ingredient, so you do need to read the label before consuming it. Those people, manufacturers will add the milk or the milk powder just to improve the texture or flavor or the creaminess of the chocolate. But yeah, it shouldn't, but it can.
Might slip in there, yeah. And if we don't eat dairy, should we be concerned about getting enough calcium?
No, you can. So if you do eliminate dairy from your diet, there are many other sources of calcium that will give you the RDA, which is like the recommended daily allowance. So sardines and other fish with edible bones are really good. Oysters, calcium fortified non-dairy milk. So you sort of aim for at least 100 grams of calcium per 100 mils. Soy often has it, and a lot of those alternatives do actually. Firm organic tofu, so that's tofu that's been set with a calcium salt will be higher in calcium, because the calcium salts, they'll be listed as a firming agent, and that's either 509 or 516 in that ingredients list. Tahini is amazing for it. That's sesame seed paste. Chia seeds, almonds, green leafy vegetables like broccoli, silver beet, kale, rocket, Asian greens, parsley, and dried figs. But one factor to note is that there are some foods that can reduce the amount of calcium that's available in your bones by binding with calcium and other minerals that are eaten at the same time. So we actually did a podcast a while back that talked about the phytates and oxalates. So you can listen to that one to learn more about them. Also, caffeine not only blocks calcium absorption, but it leaches minerals from the bones. So the more caffeine you consume, the higher the requirement of calcium consumption. So it's best not to drink more than 2 cups a day. Like when I was studying like 20 years ago, I remember my nutrition teacher was like, if you drink more than 4 cups of coffee a day, you're peeing out your bones. So I've always remembered that. But also your body needs vitamin D in order to absorb calcium. So if you don't have enough vitamin D, then you're not going to benefit from a calcium-rich diet. So you can get vitamin D from certain foods like salmon, egg yolks, and some mushrooms. And also some foods will be fortified with it, so you can get it through there. But sunshine is your best source of vitamin D. So your skin naturally produces vitamin D when it's exposed to the sun. But those with darker skin, you don't actually produce as much vitamin D as well. So supplements might be necessary for you to avoid deficiency. But also if you use sunscreen all the time when you go out, like in Australia and New Zealand, there's a lot of people there's even children now that have been born with rickets, which is like a vitamin D deficiency. So if you're putting sunscreen on all the time before you go out in the sun, then it will block your body actually absorbing the vitamin D. And vitamin D plays a major role in our immune and our hormonal health. So if you're concerned that you might not have enough, you can actually get a simple blood test to check your levels. And the ideal range is somewhere between 85 and 100.
So this is actually a good segue into the next question. Does drinking milk actually reduce the risk of osteoporosis?
So firstly, back to that vitamin D and calcium. So calcium is linked with bone health, but vitamin D promotes calcium absorption and maintains sort of an adequate blood levels of calcium and phosphate to allow for this normal bone mineralization. So without enough vitamin D, your bones can become thin and brittle, and the formation of strong new bone can be prevented. So vitamin D protects especially older adults against osteoporosis. So we really should be looking at the D more than the calcium, but they both need to be together. And then there's also, that question's somewhat controversial, because in the latest scientific reviews, like there was this large scale Harvard study that followed 72,000 women for 2 decades. They found that there was no evidence that drinking milk can prevent bone fractures or osteoporosis. And there was another study of more than 96,000 people that found that the more milk men consumed as teenagers, the more bone fractures they actually experienced as adults. And similarly, another study found that adolescent girls who consumed the most calcium, mostly in the form of dairy products, were at greater risk for stress fractures than those that were consuming less calcium. So, and there's another study that found that people who drink cow's milk have an increased risk of hip fracture compared to those who do not drink it. And that's according to the new scientific review that was published in the Journal of Nutrition Science. And in review, that was based on 13 prior studies, including 950,000 adults and 15,320 fractures overall. And they found that milk intake was directly and significantly associated with hip fracture. So they're saying that drinking 200 grams of milk a day, which is sort of just under a cup, was associated with a 7% higher risk of hip fracture compared to drinking no milk. And while drinking 400 grams, which is about 1.65 cups, it was associated with a 15% higher risk. So the authors say that the mechanisms behind potentially higher risk of hip fracture are not entirely clear, but we were talking about the D-galactose, which is a breakdown product of lactose, has been linked to oxidative stress and inflammation. So that's potentially why it increases the risk of fracture and mortality.
That's fascinating. Compared to the sort of marketing that we've been hearing for so long, it's really interesting to see those studies. And just for one last question, what about the non-dairy alternative milks? Are they any good?
Yeah, so, just like all packaged foods out there are huge differences in the quality of dairy milks or non-dairy milks that are available in the supermarkets now. So it is possible to find some that don't actually have too many additives and other ingredients, but it does require reading the ingredient list because sugar is often added in quite high amounts, especially if they're flavored with the chocolate or vanilla but actually that's true for dairy chocolate as well. So I've read some labels, and they've got as much sugar in them as Coke. So you really do need to read the label. So try unsweetened versions first, as that will help reduce your sugar content. But also ones that are higher in protein are better too. But if it's not as palatable, then you just try and get one with the lowest sugar amount. So oat milk contains this natural sugar called maltose, which is the highest glycemic index of all of those milk alternatives. So that's kind of the highest sugar amount. So if you were making a smoothie with it, you'd need to add some protein to it to avoid, a sugar crash afterwards. And for celiacs, you need to make sure it comes from a company that says that it's gluten-free, because there can be some cross-contamination with other grains in it. Soy milk contains more protein than almost all the other dairy-free milks, so that's a really good option. And a lot of those soy milk brands are also fortified with similar levels of calcium that's in dairy milk. It's also got the added benefit for menopausal women, where it helps reduce hot flushes or night sweats. And that's to do with the soy isoflavones that can attach to the estrogen receptors in our body, which reduces the amount of excess estrogen that circulates in our body re-entering the bloodstream. So it's actually quite handy. So they had clinical studies on post-menopausal women who ate high amounts of the dietary soy proteins. So we're talking about 20 to 60 grams per day. And they generally had fewer and less intense hot flushes and night sweats than those who eat less soy. So it's a good option. And also, it's actually been around since the 17th century, so it's not really as new as people think. Coconut milk's sort of really popular at the moment, and it is also a really good option. It contains a type of medium chain triglyceride, or you might have heard the term MCTs. And so MCTs stimulate energy through a process called thermogenesis, or heat production, and this can help reduce body weight and makes you feel fuller longer. So it reduces that urge to snack. It also contains lauric acid, which is an antioxidant present in the coconut milk, which can help prevent stroke and heart disease. It also has antimicrobial and anti-inflammatory properties, so it actually might also support your immune system. Rice milk is good, but it is fortified with calcium, but it is the lowest in protein, and so it also sort of tends to have a high level of natural sugar, so almost double that of soy. And then there is almond milk. So that's actually a really good alternative as well, because it contains 1 gram of carbs per serving and 1 gram of protein. So it can help with your blood sugar regulation. And not only does it have a low glycemic index, but it's also really a good source of healthy fats and calcium. So it's a good option. And these are all quite expensive to buy, but you can actually easily make almond milk at home. All you do is you soak the almonds overnight in water, and then you blend them for 1 to 2 minutes, and then you put them into like a cheesecloth or even like a really thin cotton handkerchief, and then you bundle it up, and then you squeeze the liquid out. This can be done with all nuts, and it's really cost effective, and you can control what other ingredients you want to put into it. So you can add it with vanilla, and you can use the leftover almond pulp in muffins or bake it in an almond meal for later use.
I've also come across a few brands which are now selling like the almond paste that you can make your own milk out of. So that's a really good way to stop paying for basically water in the containers. And a lot of these are quite clean with very little additives and things like that. So that could be a good option as well if you don't have the time to make it yourself. But yeah, you've taught us quite a lot today, Jenny. I think the take-home message is that there are various components that we can react to in dairy products. So it's definitely something to be mindful of if you are struggling with symptoms. So if you do want to explore whether positive association technique could be beneficial for you, you can visit our website, naturalallergytreatment.com.au, for more information. Otherwise, we'd really love to hear any other questions that you have. So feel free to leave a comment. And we'll also pop the link to the other episodes we mentioned, so you can take a bit of a deeper dive into those as well. And make sure you subscribe to our channel for any future episodes. So thanks again for today, Jenny. I'll speak to you soon.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah, speak to you next time. Great. Thanks.